will introduce themselves. And yes, and please start the recording. So without further ado, I will let our speaker introduce themselves.
Just pulling up a timer. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited and humbled to be here. So my name is Justin Leuba. I teach philosophy at Illinois Central College, a community college located in Peoria, Illinois. And I've got two cats. One's named Wendell, one's named Mary Magdalene. And I use they, them pronouns. I'm pretty excited to talk with you today about two concepts and frameworks that I use a lot in my teaching practice and my negotiation of the world. So as we go, if there's language or concepts that y'all want me to just give a quick breakdown on, feel free to just shoot a hand up. And then I'll try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So with this in mind, I'll go ahead and get started. So I've got one central claim in my presentation today, which is that open educational practices are a potential tool for the correction of epistemic injustice that systematically occurs in classroom spaces because of the inherited pedagogical norms that we tend to base our teaching on, base the structure of our classroom on, and the structure of our course design on. Educators are particularly susceptible to enacting epistemic injustice because of the nature of our position, right? But open educational practices offer an opportunity to correct that and instead to cultivate epistemic justice, epistemic virtues within our learners, right? Of course, this doesn't happen automatically, and so it's really important that open educators use epistemic justice and injustice as frameworks and concepts when we apply open educational practices. My subclaim, which I won't spend much time arguing for, is that we ought to do this. So I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir on that one, but that is a normative assumption that I'm making, is that educators ought to want to do this. We ought to want to teach in ways that are cognitively, existentially liberating and useful for our students, right? So we begin. Just a couple of key terms to get us started. I'll get into my broad view of open educational practices on the next slide in a moment. But essentially, I'm centering concepts like student empowerment, autonomy, access, and community, both as aspirations in our pedagogy and also as tools in our pedagogy. I'm also going to be talking a lot about this concept of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice refers specifically to when we are wronged in our capacity as knowers or as epistemic subjects, which really just means people who have to interpret the world, right? We interpret the world based upon our set of existing experiences, our inherited frameworks and assumptions that we use to create meaning and to understand meaning, right? So we'll talk about what it means to be wronged on that level as well, okay? So I take a very broad view of open educational practices, and these are a couple of the anchor texts that I base my conception of OEP on. I really like this 5-circle framework, right? Because it doesn't place too much emphasis on a particular thing and instead understands OEP as a holistic ethos that guides various ways of educating depending on the context, the discipline, etc. But I take a very broad view of OEP in that it utilizes OER while also using various other liberatory pedagogical practices in the classroom. All right. So, epistemology. Linda Zagzebski defines epistemology as the study of right or good ways to grasp reality, right? So when we think about what it means to grasp reality under context of oppression, we know that oppression being conditioned by oppression in the way that our various social identities intersect and shape our experiences, warps our view of the world, right? Is particularly for those who are socialized within an oppressor class, right? And so epistemic injustice, then, is an injustice at the level fundamental to our humanity in terms of how one interacts with the world, comes to understand and relate to oneself and other human beings. So Miranda Fricker is a philosopher who's done a lot of work on this concept of epistemic injustice. And she breaks it down into three basic kinds, right? A testimonial injustice occurs when somebody is wronged as a giver of testimony in virtue of some aspect of social oppression or marginalization, right? So this basically boils down to who gets believed and why, when, right? So when you think about testimony, you know, people of color are often systematically disbelieved, particularly in contexts where their punishment is at stake. Particularly, I think of Anita Hill, right, as a paradigmatic example of testimonial injustice. Because of the particular misogynoir that she experienced, her testimony was disbelieved and turned into a site of her ridicule, right? The reason for this disbelief, for this stripping away of her credibility as an epistemic subject, is because of her intersectional marginalization, particularly in a space such as the interrogation that she was subjected to. So this testimonial injustice also impacts people, for instance, with mental illness, right, whose interpretations of their experience of the world are not lent substantive credibility because of the listener's assumptions about their status as an epistemic subject, right? Hermeneutical injustice refers to injustice at the level of the social imaginary, at the kinds of concepts that we have access to, right? So a hermeneutical injustice occurs when somebody's right or good interpretation of their experience of the world is withheld from them in virtue of their marginalization. Quintessential example of this is the invention of the concept of postpartum depression in the 1960s, right? Prior to the invention of the concept of postpartum depression, people who experienced the isolation, the malaise, right, that often follows from giving birth might have assumed that the problem was them, might not have known where to turn, right? And while that still happens, we have a much more robust conceptual language with which to describe this experience. So that is the correction of a hermeneutical injustice, right? Is the filling of a gap that existed because of a particular kind of marginalization. Other kinds of hermeneutical injustices might be the creation of violent concepts that warp our interpretation of reality. For example, the invention of the super predator in the 1990s, right? So the news craze about the super predator in the 1990s still has boomers locking their car when a black person crosses the street in front of them, right? It creates this warped view of reality based on the kinds of concepts that you are taught to utilize in your interpretation of reality. This is, of course, entrenched in relations of social power, right? I'm going to skip distributive injustice because it's a little bit less central, but we can return to it if you like. So these epistemic injustices, as givers of testimony, as interpreters of the world, wrong people at the fundamental level of our humanity, right? Because my only access to the world is either through my interpretation of it or through the information that others give me, right? So my capacity to interact with the world cognitively in a good way is completely dependent on my relationships with other people and my situation within the social imaginary, right? Um, epistemic injustice is everywhere. It's pervasive. It's often systematic, though not always. Um, for instance, like a medical student might experience epistemic injustice in a hospital, but nowhere else in their life, right? That would be a non-systematic example of epistemic injustice. Um, but the kind that we're thinking about is mostly the systematic kind, conditioned by misogyny, racism, colonialism, etc. So part of the wrong of epistemic injustice is that it shapes our fundamental understanding of the world and ourselves. Right? Freire quote, of course. So apart from inquiry, apart from praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through the invention and reinventions, through the restless and patient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. What I like about this quote is that it really emphasizes knowledge, as a lifeline to the world, to what's outside of us, to something shared. Something shared, what's outside of us, but which also reflexively creates the kinds of beings that we are, shapes our consciousness. Right? And this is where pedagogy comes in. So classrooms, in particular, are products of social power, right? The way a classroom functions, the kinds of pedagogical assumptions we make, the sorts of institutions that classrooms are facilitated by or occur within, all of that is embedded in a very vast matrix of power relations, including the state, capital, cultural institutions such as the family and gender, etc. But the point is, we're not a vacuum, right? The classroom itself is a product of these power relationships, and it's a site of the reproduction of these power relationships, whether it's through the texts that we use, the resources that we use, whether it's through the way that we spatially arrange a room, right? Whether it's in the way that we communicate the concept of urgency or work ethic to our students through our due date, whatever, we're saying something about the way that students relate to the world with respect to their relationship to power. In almost every aspect of a person's pedagogy, sort of regardless of the discipline, right? It matters more in some others, the disciplines that specifically study society, identity, the stakes are a little bit different. The approach has to be different, but power shapes all classrooms, and all classrooms reproduce power. And so I turn to Freire's concept of the banking method as a paradigmatic example of the ways that epistemic injustice is perpetuated in classroom spaces. So for anyone who doesn't remember, wants a refresher, the banking method is the idea that a student is a passive recipient of knowledge, right? The professor is the epistemic authority. They are the bestower of knowledge. They are the person, the figure who basically shapes the way that a student is permitted to engage with the world, right? Within the particular context of their classroom. This theory of the student, the banking method, is also a concept of consciousness, and that consciousness is unidirectional. The world enters us, and that's it. The banking method, we are repositories, either for, the heavenly gifts from our professor who's gracious enough to bestow them upon us, or just for perception, the world itself. But the point is, it's one way. So this is an epistemic injustice for a couple of different reasons. On the one hand, it's a testimonial injustice because of the way that a student's already knowing the world is delegitimized and devalued, right? They come to the professor, and the banking method professor says, well, you are empty. You know nothing. You have no pre-existing relationship or tethers to reality from which you can draw interpretation or understanding, and therefore you are to either, whether even in the case of critical analytical stuff, you are going to give back to me what I've given to you, right? In one way or another. The hermeneutical injustice of all of this, and this is important to my argument, is that this disenfranchises students from their position as actual participants in the reproduction of knowledge as a collaborative social endeavor. So this starts sounding pretty familiar to people now, right? So the hermeneutical injustice of the banking method is, of course, that it conditions students to existentially position themselves as passive in relationship to the world. So not only is it pedagogically suspect, right, just even in terms of data analytics and outcomes, whatever, but also at a fundamental existential level to our humanity, it sort of severs what ought to be a dialectical relationship, right? And that's what gets into Freire's concept of the problem-posing method. So Freire uses Marx a lot. And so this idea of dialectics comes up a lot. And simply put, dialectics refers to a way of thinking about things that mutually influence one another, right? So in that mutual influence, a new thing emerges. Marx specifically talks about the contradictions of capitalism and all of that. Freire thinks about dialectics specifically in terms of a human being's relationship to kind of a shared reality, right? In other words, I am made by reality. I'm conditioned by power. I am a subject of my experiences, but also I condition reality. I act in the world. The world is in virtue of how we make it, right? The world is something that is malleable. It is dynamic. It is a human endeavor, right? And Freire tells a story in chapter 2 where he's talking to a Brazilian or Chilean peasant, and the peasant says, without human beings, there would be no world. And Freire says, why? And he responds, because there would be no one to call it a world, right? So this idea of making a world of meaning, of shared experience, is fundamental to this idea of epistemology. And so problem posing refers to starting with students' lived experiences of the world and then building out a capacity for interpretation, understanding, critical analysis from there in a way that disrupts the student-teacher hierarchy, right? Both epistemic and institutional. So not only does this have benefits at the pedagogical level, just in terms of student outcomes, but it also shapes our learners' consciousness in more socially just ways. It encourages them to cultivate that epistemic tether to a shared world in a dialectical fashion. I am made by the world. In turn, I shape the world, which then shapes me again, right? Okay. This is a great quote, but I only have 10 minutes left. Okay, so what does this have to do with epistemic injustice? With this, I turn to the work of Jose Medina, who argues that our epistemic characteristics, so whether I'm open-minded or particularly skeptical, or whether I choose to see the world through an anti-racist lens, that's an epistemic characteristic as well, right? Those ways in which I interpret the world, the concepts I use to relate to the world, are a product of my experience and my relationship to the social imaginary, or the sort of big collection of concepts and experiences that we all draw from and relate to in various different ways, depending on our standpoint. So we ought to, according to Medina, cultivate the kinds of epistemic virtues associated with people who are epistemically oppressed, right? Such as assertive epistemic humility, curiosity, open-mindedness, etc. And we should attempt to move away from epistemic vices often associated with power, and power, the ignorance that is reproduced through power, arrogance, laziness, closed-mindedness, etc. This isn't to say that subject position determines epistemic characteristics. It's rather sort of saying, if we're all looking at a big view, being someone who experiences marginalization gives you a better vantage from which to view the reality of marginalization, right? That doesn't mean that you'll look closely, but you're situated better. Similarly, if you're somebody who benefits from power and oppression, you'll probably have to go a little farther out of your way to find liberatory epistemic resources, right? They're not going to be rooted in your lived experience. So our ability to act upon the social imaginary is essential for resistance of any kind, but particularly epistemic, and empowering our students with the epistemic and existential tools to act upon the social imaginary is one of our greatest responsibilities as educators. Again, regardless of the discipline, right? So in virtue of the power that we have to enact epistemic injustice, whether from choosing a particularly expensive textbook to situating our students as passive recipients of knowledge, to encouraging our students to relate to their grades as sources of their human value, whatever, we have immense power to enact epistemic injustice, which means we also have an immense responsibility to make sure that epistemic justice is central to our practice. This is a nice one. Through practices of resistance, we can learn to go beyond the strictures of inherited cognitive and affective habits, and we can learn to envision new cognitive affective attitudes and orientations towards others. Both our ability and inability to relate to others is mediated by the social imagination, which opens our eyes and hearts to certain things and not others, enabling and constraining our social gaze. So open educational practices, I think, can play a central role in bringing about epistemic justice in our classrooms and in society more broadly. In part because open educational practices aim for our students' self-actualization as learners. It recognizes the extent to which that self-actualization is facilitated by community as well. But this kind of self-actualization, learning to establish a cognitive grasp of reality in a right or good way, is essential for social change. So the 5 dimensions of OEP that we talked about earlier, the use of open licensing to position learning as a commons, utilizing a culture of collaboration, particularly cultures of collaboration that disrupt student-teacher hierarchies, right? And getting students to participate in one's pedagogy, whether at the level of content construction or designing the structure of the course. Embracing learners from non-academic settings by centering lived experience and centering testimonial justice in the communication of that lived experience. Using that lived experience in community to build out your classroom's set of hermeneutical resources, right? As well as seeking a diversity of cultural voices in order to develop a kaleidoscopic picture of the world. That being said, though, any one of these practices, right, whether you're using OER, whether you're utilizing participatory pedagogy, all of these things can be done in a way that still facilitates epistemic injustice. In the keynote, you know, I don't just want to give out free white supremacy and free patriarchy, right? It's not like we can check a box. It's not like it's a plug and play set of practices. It has to be done with an ethos, and it is inherently dialectical. In engaging in open educational practices will be changed, hopefully every semester, right? At the level of our personhood, kind of our fundamental relationship to reality. That's okay. So I don't want to just go down a list of tools, but a couple of things that I really like to do in my own practice include co-constructing the standards and norms of a classroom space and implementing renewable assignments. So by co-constructing standards, I'm talking mostly about rubrics. I don't like rubrics. I don't like to make them. I hate evaluating my students. It's my least favorite part. But I find that when you turn it into a philosophical conversation about what it means to do something well, students hold themselves to pretty high standards. And then you don't have to be the villain. You say, well, look, I'm just kidding. But the point is, offering students an opportunity to design the kind of experience that they are subjecting themselves to, right? Hopefully enthusiastically, but not always, can really give them a stake in the space. It can really make it feel as if they're involved in the community as opposed to just along for the ride, right? I also love to co-construct content, right? Whether that is in terms of students creating content for one another, or in the case of renewable assignments, I love to provide students with opportunities to get their work into the world, right? So a renewable assignment meets 4 criteria. It's created by the student. It's some kind of artifact, right? A video or a paper. Student created, carries value beyond the learner's education. So let's say you post it online. My student wrote a 500-word philosophy essay breaking down the mind-body problem, right? Somebody else in a philosophy class might locate that essay and say, hey, you explained this in a way that really enlightened me. This helped clear it up for me. They may never know, right? But it's a scenario I like to point their attention to. When you participate in knowledge as an open collaborative endeavor, it connects you to people in ways that will remain oblivious to, right, for forever, which I think is kind of nice, but it sounds sad when you say it like that. And it's openly licensed, right? So utilizing technology and copyright as an opportunity to engage with this concept of a knowledge commons. In any case, these renewable assignments can position students in a dialectical relationship, particular to the material and to the activity of knowledge production itself, particularly when it's done collaboratively amongst with each other. And that's what I had, and it's almost exactly 10 minutes until 10 minutes until end. So I am really excited to have a conversation with you all. If there's anything you'd like to go back and look at again, or concept you'd like to revisit, questions, anything you resonated with, I'm excited to talk. Excited to listen.
Just for my own intellectual curiosity, I know you said that it probably didn't really apply, but what was that third kind of the distributive
Yeah.
justice?
So good. So distributive epistemic injustice has to do with how knowledge resources are allocated. So classic example, disparities in school funding, right? There's a big distributive injustice at the epistemic level in terms of the kinds of funding that different schools have access to. It's also a regular injustice, right? It's not just an epistemic injustice, but there's that particular epistemic dimension to it. Or let's say when students who are deemed unworthy of a certain standard or degree of educational access are put or isolated in particular classrooms, that would be an example of a distributive epistemic injustice because of the way that access to spaces that could be enriching or empowering is differentially allocated by subject position. So these are most often things that are just injustices full stop with a particular epistemic dimension that you can analyze. Thank you for your question.
Hi, I just quickly wanted to thank you for explaining this concept, which is something that I've heard of, but never really carved out the time to explore. I think the framing of it is so rich for all kinds of explorations into teaching and learning. And specifically, the connection to epistemic resistance is sort of helping me reconcile some of like the uncomfy reaction I had to the keynote. Just the way that resistance was framed in that space. It's really helping me make some connections there. So I just again wanted to thank you. This was really extremely helpful.
Thank you. I'm so glad you found it useful.
I think you put this into practice in your courses and they're philosophy based, right?
Mhm,
Okay.
yes.
And so students are probably already familiar what epistemic is in
Yeah, I taught this
general.
last week. It was fun.
Okay, so there we go. So like they're familiar. I'm thinking of all the other miscellaneous courses where this absolutely can be implemented, but the transparency aspect of it is maybe a little more challenging. How do you get an engineering student to understand what is epistemic, period? Not even adding justice to the tail end of it, let alone digging in deeper to be like, hey, this is why you're giving us information from your own personal experience and how engineering. I'm not an engineering person. I don't know why I chose that, but that's where we're living. But like, how do you have suggestions for that transparency for making students realize, oh, this is why we're having you contribute in this sort of capacity? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could go about framing it in a couple of different ways. You could start with the concept of epistemic, or you could try to get at epistemic justice kind of entirely. I think just asking someone first, how do you know when you know something, right? As a way to get at this idea of epistemology, or how do you get information about the world and yourself, right? That's another good way to introduce this idea of epistemology. And then secondly, setting the point of like the way that everyone gets information about the world is a social process. This textbook didn't just appear in front of you, right? Whether it's an engineer, like industrial ed or agri, anything. So you could make it a question about authorship. Who wrote this? Who got to write it, right? I think a lot of textbooks are often, do they have corporate sponsors, or like what goes into the research behind various textbooks, figuring out figuring out what went into it. Asking the question, how does power relate to this? So I don't know, in engineering, I don't know anything about engineering, but I'm sure there are some mechanisms embedded in social power that determine what kind of knowledge is valued and what isn't, or like which kinds of engineers get paid a lot and who doesn't, right? And that's a question that'll get their interest. And then once you can say, well, there's a reason for that, then you can talk about epistemology. Whose knowledge gets valued and why? And what kind of assumptions about the world go into creating that perspective or reality? So you don't even need to call it epistemic justice. I mean, that's how I came to it, because of my background. But really, it's just a question of how our social location, wherever that may be, shapes our understanding of the world and our ability to communicate about that world with others. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we have two questions in the chat. The first one is, do you have any suggestions for how librarians or others who don't teach classes can get involved in this work?
Totally. So when it comes to librarians, I think librarians, first of all, are like the rock stars of the higher education world, and I will die on that hill for sure. But have an essential role to play in ameliorating for hermeneutical injustices. Because a hermeneutical injustice refers to a gap in someone's knowledge resources, in their conceptual resources, right? And so I think when it comes to filling in gaps in our collective set of conceptual resources, with respect to oppression and power, I think that very much depends on where you are in the world, right? So in the United States, it would mean maybe curating collections or displays about issues in social justice or the history of the oppressed. If you're in Australia, it might involve making sure that you have substantial resources for and by Aboriginal people. I mean, it depends on the particular context of one's oppression, but I think specifically emphasizing the role of librarians and correcting for hermeneutical injustice is going to be really important.
Hi. So
Hi.
I actually wanted to like kind of go off of like the student question but come at it from like the faculty side. So I'm not a teacher, but I work with them, and I come from a university that is definitely in financial disparity. So a lot of the professors just end up getting caught up in the grind of it. It's all like display the information, take in the homework. And currently for funding, our institution is trying to like get out of that. So there's kind of a rough transition for a lot of professors. Do you have any suggestions to help with those professors and understanding this? I'm sorry if that didn't make any sense.
No. That's hard, right? It's hard to play the part adequately and still, live and work according to one's values or in full alignment with one's values. And so the first thing is, of course, to remember that our authority comes from our students, right? And it's not authority over students, but our responsibility ultimately is to our students and it's not to the institution. That is especially so if you have tenure. So unfortunately, academics, depending on our position, have to negotiate a lot of precarity, and people have to do that in the ways that are most comfortable for them. But unfortunately, it's either overwork yourself and try to stay inspired, or stop maybe fulfilling an occupational identity that's oriented primarily towards an institution, and instead orient your occupational identity around your ability to empower your students first and foremost.
We had one more question in the chat. It says, what support can we don't teach but support OE at our institutions provide for faculty to do this work?
Could you repeat that?
It's worded kind of interesting. I think it's kind of just asking what support can the institutions provide to the faculty, to do this work?
Time, money, space, maybe in that order. So time first and foremost. Money, I don't mean that in the sense of like, our metric shouldn't be dollars, either as people or as a movement, right? But we have to live. And so when it comes to, especially when it comes to getting stuff off the ground, like my institution, my dean, Lynette Oliver, she's awesome, but she used some grant money, for instance, to pay people who took a 6-hour workshop on culturally responsive teaching, right? Adjuncts, okay? And so that's not to say that adjuncts will only show up if there's money involved. Instead, it's saying by financially supporting these kinds of projects, you can allow adjuncts to show up, permit them to, and space too for community building, right? So it really does, especially with OER building, institutional support is huge. Time, money, space, and personnel. That's the fourth thing I would add. Hire instructional designers, hire organizers who can spearhead these kinds of projects.
Excellent. Well, why don't we all give our speaker a nice round of applause?
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the folks online as well. Appreciate it.